We're looking at the many causes leading up to the conflict between the North and the South. We've seen that one of the primary sources of conflict was slavery, but there were others as well. And especially as we get close to the years when war actually takes place, one of the major contentions was over the issue of the tariffs. We saw how that the southern states were paying the vast majority of the amount of tariff money, and yet about the same percentage, 89% of it, was going to northern interests. So the South was essentially funding the North, and they didn't think that that was fair. That's one of the major issues coming up to the conflict itself, the fighting itself, I should say, recognized by both North and South, as we will see. A fifth area, and one that we'll spend some time on because it's so important, is the conflict of constitutional principles. In other words, it's an issue of states' rights versus federal rights. It's the issue of the Union versus independence. It's looking at are there rights that the states have relative to the federal government, or does the national government have total control? And this, I believe, is the central issue that sparked the conflict. All right. Now, notice I'm making a difference between those issues that were contentious all along, those issues that created a divide between North and South, and the issue that I believe actually sparked the actual conflict, the actual fighting. All right, do you follow what I'm saying? There are a number of issues that led to the fighting, but there's one issue that actually sparked the fighting itself, and that is this conflict of constitutional principles. In other words, could states that voluntarily join the Union by ratifying the Constitution voluntarily leave that same Union? That's why I had you looking in the Constitution last week to see if there was anything in there about the perpetuity of the Union, that is, once states are in, are they in for good? Can they not leave? And as you found out, you could not find that there. This was an issue that goes all the way back to the War for Independence. Since that time, two camps emerged within the colonies, which then became the states of the United States. There were those that were arguing for greater states' rights, and those arguing that the federal government needed to have more control. We saw that in the film we watched about George Washington's first term of office. The issues between Jefferson and Hamilton were somewhat around those issues. The first organized government in the United States, both during and after the War for Independence, was what? What was the first government? What was the Constitution? What? Articles of Confederation. Remember that? The 13 states formed a loose confederation with a very weak federal government. However, there were a lot of problems that arose as a result of the weakness of that form of government, which caused the leaders at the time to come together at the Constitutional Convention and create, we have to admit, in secret, the U.S. Constitution. And for good reason, when they were meeting to discuss the Constitution, they were not permitted to talk about it outside, because that would have brought undue influence from outside forces onto what was happening at the convention itself. But it was something that was not intended by those that first said we need to have a convention. Remember, the original purpose was to simply change the Articles of Confederation, and in reality they scrapped it and wrote something new. By the way, in the Articles of Confederation, it does say that there is a perpetuity of this union, that they can never leave, and yet they totally scrapped the whole thing. So the writing of the U.S. Constitution was an effort to bring a little more power to the national government in order to take care of the problems that arose because of the weakness of a national government in the Articles of Confederation. And now, strong proponents of states' rights, like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, were not present at the Constitutional Convention. In fact, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson was in France at the time, and he said, when he heard about the Constitutional Convention, said that he smelled a rat. He thought that there was nothing that was going to be good to come out of that. But, of course, he later served as president. Many felt that the new Constitution ignored the rights of states to continue to act independently, and that it took too much power away from the states. They felt the states should still have the right to decide if they were willing to accept certain federal acts. And this resulted in the idea of nullification, which you've read about, whereby the states would have the right to rule federal acts unconstitutional. In other words, the state could say, we don't think this law enacted by Congress is constitutional. It goes against our rights, and therefore we are not going to enforce it in our state. We are going to ignore it in our state. We nullify it. We say it is no value. It is not legal. The federal government denied states this right. Of course, they said you can't do that. However, proponents such as John C. Calhoun fought vehemently for nullification. When nullification would not work and states felt that they were no longer respected, they moved toward secession. Not succession, S-U-C-S-E-C. Secession means to separate. And so, as I said, I think this is the central issue that sparked the conflict. Could states that voluntarily join the Union, by ratifying the Constitution, voluntarily leave that same Union? Now, 3 states had even put that as a prerogative when ratifying the Constitution. In other words, there were 3 states, Rhode Island, Virginia, and New York, that said the only reason we will ratify this Constitution is if we can leave if we don't want to stay in. And New York is one of those, and Virginia. And, of course, Rhode Island always wanted to do their own thing. Historically, the issue of secession was not tied to a particular region, but rather to particular circumstances. So whenever we hear about secession, we generally think about the southern states seceding from the Union, and so we think that was a southern thing. But it's not. We'll go back even further, go back into Europe. If you think about it, the origin of Protestantism in the Reformation is that of groups of people leaving the established organization, the Roman Catholic Church, to form their own. They seceded from the Roman Catholic Church. They separated from the Roman Catholic Church. The history of the early colonization of America is that of people seceding from their association with England and or the Church of England. You think about the separatists who came over. Separatists, let's see, what were they doing? Well, they were separating from the Church of England. They were seceding from the Church of England. And the Puritans, as they came over, they were seceding from control of the Church of England over them, even as they served in Parliament. And so there was a secession that was a part of the early colonization of America. The War of Independence was not a revolution, as I have told you. It was a war of secession from England. It was a war of separation, of independence, not of revolution. In 1798, Jefferson and Madison, Jefferson kind of dubious about the whole Constitutional Convention, Madison heavily involved enough that he's called the father of the Constitution, both of them together proposed secession as a tool to curtail excessive federal power. They said the only way, if federal power, if the national government gets too strong that you can't do anything about it, the only alternative is to separate, to secede. Now you might be interested to know that the New England states threatened secession 5 different times. First of all, in 1803, fearing that the Louisiana Purchase would dilute their political power, the New England states threatened to secede. In 1807, the Embargo Act was unfavorable to commerce, which, of course, New England is heavily involved in trade, and so they threatened to secede. In 1812, over the admission of Louisiana as a state, they threatened to secede. And in 1814, during the War of 1812, discontented Federalists in New England that were against the war, because again it was hurting trade, suggested secession. In fact, they met in someplace in Hartford, Connecticut, at the Hartford Convention. They were, in fact, meeting there together, representatives of the New England states, to proceed with the option of seceding from the United States when the war ended, and that made it unnecessary. And then in 1814, New England once again threatened secession over the annexation of Texas. So if you look at the history of secession in this country, you'll find that it's New England states more than any other section that are threatening secession throughout the history of our country. The war, another thing that, reason why I think that the constitutional principle conflict is the main reason for the actual war is the war resolution approved by the House of Representatives itself. It was approved on July 22nd, 1861. They stated, this is the United States Congress says, here's why we're going to war against the southern states. They stated the purpose of going to war was, quote, to defend and maintain the supremacy of the Constitution and to preserve the Union. It said nothing about interfering with slavery at all. Had nothing to do with slavery. Unionists argued for the indissolubility of the Union from Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution, which is called the Supremacy Clause. Now, that clause has been used for a lot of things over the years, and they were using it at that point to say that if a state ratified the Constitution, then they were establishing the United States government as the supreme law of the land, and therefore were binding themselves to an indissoluble compact, making secession illegal. In other words, by ratifying the Constitution, they were saying the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and therefore we have to always obey it, and that means we can't ever separate from it. We can't ever leave. And before we look at what Lincoln said about this, let's take a little bit of a side trip into Lincoln himself. A couple of interesting things about him. You maybe have heard the story about how why he grew his beard. This is Lincoln as he appeared through most of his life. But he got a letter from a young lady who said, if you let your whiskers grow, I will try and get the rest of them to vote for you. She says, all the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president. Well, Lincoln apparently thought that sounded like a good idea. So that's why he grew the famous whiskers by which most of us know him. Now, if you know anything about Abraham Lincoln, you know that before he became president, by many accounts, he was a failure. Here are a number of the things that he tried. He failed in business in 1831. He was defeated for the legislature in 1832. He failed in business again in 1833. Had a nervous breakdown in 1836. Defeated for speaker. Well, he was elected, in between here. Defeated for speaker in 1838. Defeated for elector in 1840. Defeated for Congress in 1843. Again in 1848. Defeated for the Senate in 1855. Defeated for vice president in 1856. Defeated for the Senate in 1858, and then he's elected president. So if you're looking for somebody who is successful in life to be president, that wouldn't have been Lincoln. All right, but he kept working at it. That's the thing that we can gain from looking at Lincoln. When you fail, you get up and you keep going, right? You try again, and that's what he did. And eventually, he is elected president. Someone said the journey of 1,000 miles begins with but a single step. And the poorest of all men is not the man without a cent, but the man without a dream. And he had a dream. All right, but this is what Lincoln said concerning his goal. He said, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. That's his number one goal, is to save the Union. And it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps save the Union. Or does that sound like he was fighting the war to free the slaves? Absolutely not. An underlying purpose must also include the desire to maintain the tax revenues that flowed from the South. 90% of the tax income came from the tariff that primarily burdened the South. So, for the North's perspective, their reason for attacking the South was to save the Union, to prevent states from leaving the Union. It was not to eliminate slavery. If there was any issue, any cause that we've looked at leading up to this that the North was concerned about, in addition to keeping states in the Union, it was for the purpose of keeping that flow of money coming from the South, keeping the money from the tariffs coming. And we'll see, there's a quote from Lincoln later on about that. All right, so Southern leaders asserted the constitutional right of secession based on state sovereignty. Each state was viewed as an independent entity, joined in a compacted union with other independent states. This is called a confederacy. Now you might argue, well, we moved from a confederacy to a federal government. But remember too that the U.S. Constitution says that any rights or any authority not given to the federal government, to the national government, is to be reserved for the states. So the states still had a lot of authority. And the southern states were simply saying, we're going to exercise that authority by leaving. This was something that, again, was understood by people on both sides. James Madison had written in Federalist 39, remember the Federalist Papers were articles that were written to encourage people to vote for, to ratify the Constitution. This is what James Madison wrote. Each state, in ratifying the Constitution, is considered as a sovereign body independent of all others, and only to be bound by its own voluntary act. In this relation, then, the new Constitution will, if established, be a federal and not a national Constitution. The difference being that a national Constitution does not take into account any of the subdivisions under it. A federal Constitution looks at the national government and the state governments as sharing power, not one being over the other. Jefferson Davis, who became the first and only president of the Confederate States of America, defended this concept from the Articles of Confederation and the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. He said, while secession was constitutional, he pointed out that the declaration of war by Lincoln without congressional approval was not. So he's saying the Confederate States of America were acting constitutionally, but Lincoln, as President of the United States, was not acting according to the Constitution. He says, our cause was so just, so sacred, that had I known all that has come to pass, he wrote this after the war was over, had I known all that had come to pass, had I known what was to be inflicted upon me, all that my country was to suffer, all that our posterity was to endure, I would do it all over again. Why? Because he was a man of principle. It was the principle of the thing, whether they won or lost. In the South, the war was viewed as a second war for independence. They made the same arguments for leaving the Union that the colonies made for leaving England. And that is, there's a tyrannical government. And we have tried to work with them. We've done everything and we can. There's nothing left but to leave. Same arguments, exactly. Now, going back to what Jefferson Davis said about Lincoln, his declaration of war being unconstitutional. That's not the only unconstitutional thing that Lincoln did. You could also add the unconstitutional suspending of habeas corpus. Are you familiar with habeas corpus? Not familiar? In other words, you just can't arrest people willy-nilly. You have to have a reason for arresting them. You have to produce that reason. Lincoln said, we're not going to abide by habeas corpus. And so he arrested people that either printed things or said things against his government. He arrested, he sent 75,000 troops into the South without congressional approval. He arrested and detained many people without trial or relief. He quartered large bodies of troops among Southern citizens. He imposed an embargo on Southern ports, he also created the U.S. income tax on the nation, which was distinctly unconstitutional. The Constitution expressly forbade an income tax. But he did it. All these things were done without congressional approval. He caused to be deported a U.S. citizen named Clement L. Vallandigham. If I remember correctly, I think he was living in Ohio. After he was arrested without a warrant, he caused to be deported from Georgia to Indiana hundreds of women and children. The accounts I've read is that in certain towns, the women and children were rounded up and sent north, and the people that remained there in that area never heard from them again. They disappeared. And Lincoln shut down newspapers. Freedom of the press, not under Abraham Lincoln. If you printed things that he didn't like, he would have them shut down. So many areas in which Lincoln was acting against the Constitution, unconstitutional. The next point I want to make under the conflict of constitutional principles is the fact that pro-unionists also recognized the legality of secession. Those that were for the Union, those that were Northerners, still recognized that secession was legal. Daniel Webster, native of New Hampshire, one of the most prominent and leading attorneys in the country, and an advocate of preserving the Union. He was as pro-Union as you could get. But here's what he said. We have repeatedly said, and we once more insist, that the great principle embodied by Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, is sound and just, and that if the slave states, the cotton states, or the Gulf states only choose to form an independent nation, they have a moral right to do so. Now that's in agreement with what he had stated earlier in 1833, when he said, quote, if the states were not left to leave the Union when their rights were interfered with, the government would have been national, but the convention refused to baptize it by the name. If the Union was formed by the accession of states, then the Union may be dissolved by the secession of states, unquote. Webster added in 1851, quote, the Union is a union of states founded upon compact. How is it to be supposed that when different parties enter into a compact for certain purposes, either can disregard one provision of it and expect others to observe the rest? If the northern states willfully and deliberately refuse to carry out their part of the Constitution, the South would be no longer bound to keep the compact. A bargain broken on one side is broken on all sides. That almost sounds like a Southerner talking, doesn't it? But this was somebody who knew the law. This was a person who was steeped in the Constitution, who was an excellent thinker. By the way, Webster was a committed Christian who strove to live by biblical standards in all of his life. And he felt the same was important for the United States. He said this, if we abide by the principles taught in the Bible, our country will go on prospering. But if we and our posterity neglect its instruction and authority, no man can tell how sudden a catastrophe may overwhelm us and bury all our glory in a profound obscurity, unquote. When he was asked what he considered to be the most serious thought that had ever entered his mind, can you imagine? I mean, you're asking this brilliant guy, this guy who has been speaking. He's been a great orator. He's famous. And he was asked, what was the most brilliant thought that ever entered your mind? I wonder what you would say if someone asked you that. What's the most brilliant thought that ever entered your mind? He said this: the most solemn thought that has ever entered my mind is my accountability to my Maker. 1 week before the election of 1852, Webster died. He died with the assurance that because he trusted in Christ for eternal life, even though his physical life on earth was over, that he would live forever with Christ in a resurrected body. Because of this belief, his last words, you can always tell a lot about a person by their last words, right? His last words to friends and family were spoken with as much conviction as all the words he had spoken in his life. With the assurance of eternal life with Christ, his last words, as his dying words were, "I still live." Isn't that something? Another person, George Lunt of Massachusetts, said this: had President Buchanan in 1860 sent an armed force to prevent the nullification of the fugitive slave law, as Andrew Jackson threatened to do in 1833, there would have been a secession of 15 northern states instead of 13 southern states. Had the Democrats won out in 1860, the northern states would have been the seceding states, not the southern. So, I want you to understand, this is not a southern issue. This is an issue that in different parts of the country they debated at different times. Editorials in northern newspapers recognized the right of southern states to secede. Congressman Abraham Lincoln in 1848 had said, any people anywhere being inclined and having the power have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. This is a most valuable and most sacred right, a right which we hope and believe is to liberate the world. Now you wonder, how could he say that in 1848 and then have such a different point of view in 1860? I think we'll get to the real reason for that in a little while. Ulysses S. Grant, a famous general of this war, said, the right of revolution is an inherent one. When people are oppressed by their government, it is a natural right they enjoy to relieve themselves of the oppression, if they are strong enough, either by withdrawal from it or by overthrowing it and substituting a government more acceptable. But any people who resort to this remedy stake their lives, their property, and every claim for protection given by citizenship on the issue. Victory, or the conditions imposed by the conqueror, must be the result. So he's saying anybody has the right to revolt against the government that is oppressing them, but you got to understand, you're willing to sacrifice everything in order to do it. And either you're going to be victorious or you're going to be conquered and you'll have to suffer the consequences. Men who fought on both sides. Oh, there's the quote. I have it out of order. Here's Lincoln's quote about any people anywhere have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government. Now, to further accentuate the idea that the war itself was not about slavery, there were men who fought on both sides who were pro-slavery and anti-slavery. General Robert E. Lee, the most famous general of the Confederacy, right? Who was offered the command of the Union Army and would eventually command the Confederate Army, was anti-slavery and anti-secession. Lee freed the slaves he had received from his father-in-law's will. By the way, his father-in-law, anybody know who his father-in-law was? George Washington Custis, the step-grandson of George Washington. Remember Little Wash in the film, in the movie?
Yes.
That was Robert E. Lee's father-in-law. Lee declared slavery a moral and political evil. He advocated gradual emancipation of slaves. He was convinced that a mild and melting Christian influence would resolve slavery rather than war. On the other side, Major Robert Anderson, the commander of Fort Sumter, which you remember is where the fighting actually starts. He's the Union commander of Fort Sumter. He was a slave owner. And he also believed in the right of secession. The person who was firing shots against him was his former student, and he was anti-slavery, firing for the Confederacy. So you see, slavery was not the issue among those that were fighting at all. A Southern person may have said, we had a right to pull out. Political parties were out of control in Washington. The North imposed unfair tariff laws on our crops. Northern fanatics were inspiring slave uprisings in our midst. The North was jealous of our prosperous South and of the number of leaders we had sent to the presidency. We never meant war. We just didn't want anything more to do with the Yankees. Interesting that even the Cherokee people, the Cherokee Nation, Indians living in the southwest United States, recognized what was happening. They were the best educated of the American Indian tribes. And on October 28, 1861, the National Council of Cherokee People issued a declaration uniting with the Confederate States of America. Their lengthy document includes a statement of alarm over, quote, a violated constitution, all civil liberty in peril, and all rules of civilized warfare and the dictates of common humanity and decency unhesitatingly disregarded. And that's the seal of the Cherokee Nation. Here's a Cherokee Indian dressed in his Confederate uniform. All right, so there were many reasons behind the idea of secession. There wasn't hardly anybody that didn't believe that states had the right to secede. But when they did, we're going to see why. Why was it then that President Lincoln and the Union acted so strongly to keep the southern states in? There's another underlying conflict, and that's a religious conflict. I don't think I have this in your notes even. Something I just learned in recent years. And that's the debate over authority interpretation of Scripture. By 1850, the original Calvinism of the New England Puritans had been in steep decline for generations. The Calvinism and Orthodox Christianity of the Puritan Fathers was being eroded and displaced by the old faux deism, Unitarianism, Universalism, and Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism is like the modern New Age movement. You know, that God is out there somewhere, or God's in everything. And the antecedents of modern liberalism, which denigrates the miracles of the Bible, doesn't believe in a lot of things in the Bible. The authority of Scripture, the sovereignty of God, and the centrality of Christ's redeeming grace were fighting a rearguard battle against secularism and numerous heresies. In addition, the man-centered preaching of Charles Finney, which we've looked at, further weakened the theology of Northern Christianity. So, remember I told you when we looked at the Second Great Awakening, I mentioned that it was the Western branch of the Second Great Awakening on up into the following movements of Finney and so on that have more affected Christianity today than the First Great Awakening has. And it was affecting the theology of the North in particular at that time. The godly zeal of the first Puritans had been replaced by a zeal to reform society by government force. So instead of working to change the hearts of people, it was using government to change society. The denigration of biblical truth can be seen in Northern attitudes towards the treasonous actions of John Brown, such as Julia Ward Howe, author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. You've all heard that song, maybe even sung it. She stated this: John Brown will glorify the gallows like Jesus glorified the cross. Meanwhile, while Christian theology and doctrine was going downhill in the North, in the South, dramatic revival was taking place. And it continued into the war, with as many as 150,000 conversions in the Confederate Army alone. Some chaplains estimated that over 25% of the men in the Confederate armies were converted during the war. There seems to be very little impact of the gospel within the Union Army, at least in the early part of the war. Some of that may be because in the Union Army there are very few generals you can find that were committed Christians. And in the Southern Army there were many committed Christians among the generals. So we're looking at the causes, and the central cause of the conflict. And there's what I just said. Sorry, I didn't realize I had a slide for it there. I think it's out of order from where I was, but Orthodox Christianity, biblical Christianity was being eroded. Revival was taking place in the South. Joey.
Is this a Great Awakening?
It is not called a Great Awakening. It's generally just called the revival of the Confederate armies, or revival in the Confederate armies. But it's not by most people given the status of an awakening. But I think you probably could. Some see it as an extension of the Second Great Awakening. You know, that it just kind of what happened to the Second Great Awakening kind of continued on, and then it exploded again for a while during the war. I have a book that talks about the revival in the Confederate armies, and it's just page after page of letters from chaplains saying, please send us more materials. The soldiers want Bibles. They want devotional literature. Please, you know, they're just constantly begging for materials to give to their soldiers. And you find accounts of Confederate generals encouraging their men to go to worship service, you know, to be involved in all those kind of things. All right, so next time we'll look at why secede. Then essentially we've seen is something that almost everyone agreed was the right of states to do. So why did the South actually secede, and why did the North react the way they did? I know it's time for tomorrow. Just look over your notes, try to get a handle on things. If you don't understand something, make sure that you come back with a question tomorrow.